But if you have a government that's actually cheating you all the time, that's not performing its task, that doesn't understand what its task is, it's basically useless or worse.
Dear friends, welcome to another edition of Forum 2000 Online Chat. Before I introduce our next guest speaker, I would like to make a quick announcement. It's about the Forum 2000 Annual Conference. As you may already know, Forum 2000 is taking place this year online from October 12th through October 14th. As all the previous forums, this year's forum is taking on yet another gargantuan task, may I say, as the theme this year is about the need to restore responsibility and solidarity in a rapidly transforming world. Now, please go ahead on Forum 2000's website for more details about the upcoming forum. I, in the meantime, would like to go back to our guest speaker today. I have the pleasure of welcoming Vesna Pusić. Is that right?
That's very, very correct.
To our virtual studio today. Ms. Pusić is a member of the Croatian Parliament, former Minister of Foreign and European Affairs, founding member and leader of the Croatia's People's Party Liberal Democrats. In 2016, Ms. Pusić was the Republic of Croatia's official candidate for the UN Secretary General. The same year, she was awarded the Chevalier de l'Ordre National de la Légion d'Honneur, or shortly, and easier, Legion of Honor, award by the President of the French Republic. Ms. Pusić was one of the 7 women who initiated the first feminist organization in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, called Women and Society, and not surprisingly was widely criticized by the authorities at the time. Ms. Pusić is a professor of sociology and political theory at University of Zagreb, and author of several books and numerous scientific and professional articles, and is actually also currently writing, in the process of writing a chapter for a book as well. Ms. Pusić, welcome, and thank you for being here with us.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
As a woman, obviously, my first question to you is actually about your experience as a woman politician, especially since the time when you were among the founders of a first feminist organization. It is year 2020. We're still seeing mass inequality and employment opportunities and pay gaps and many other issues that we keep talking about. How do you see the direction we're headed in? Is there any hope that at some point, time and place, these issues won't be part of a discussion and will eventually resolve and find long-term solutions?
After a long experience, I would say that these issues are a never-ending story. I don't think they will ever be resolved in the sense that we could say, we've dealt with this, we will sort of put this aside because we have achieved this, and we can move on. I think that, like most human rights issues, or all human rights issues, once you stop working on them, once you stop being very proactive about them, there is a major backsliding, and there is a major, deterioration. And at the moment, we are, I think, in the period of deteriorating rights, and including women's rights, but in general, this notion that people, regardless of all other characteristics, have certain rights as human beings, have certain rights as citizens. This has deteriorated. Also, the notion that there is some kind of there is a set of, let's say, universally applied criteria that apply to all people in terms of, what's just or what's right or what's good, this or what's smart. This has been completely mixed up, and in many ways, it's like in some of the Orwellian or Monty Pythonian works of art, when good is bad, ugly is pretty, wrong is right, etc., almost to the point of a caricature. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, if anything, that should focus our minds. And I was reminded the other day when I was with some friends of mine, including one friend who was with me this many years ago when we were 7 of us were founding this feminist organization, first feminist organization in that time Yugoslavia. We watched together the mini-series Mrs. America about the women's right or Equal Rights Amendment movement and women's rights movement in America, as opposed to a very conservative backlash led by Phyllis Schlafly. Mm-hmm. And, it showed how these things didn't change. In a way, awareness about them obviously changed. But the necessity of having people that will put these issues, and not only women's issues, but in general human rights issues, that will put them center stage, this is the task of every generation. And I would say that it's not that generation failed. On the contrary, they did their task. It's just that this generation also needs to do their task, which is put these things center stage. One thing you could also see is that today's politics, with which we are, I think, justifiably pretty disappointed globally, not only in our respective countries, but globally, not to a small extent because of the amount of lying and deceit and untruth and deception that it involves. This is also not new. This was also present continuously. It's sometimes more prevalent, let's say, more prevalent in the sense that you almost don't see the other kind of politics or the other kind of approach to public discourse or to, and if you do, you have the feeling that that people are almost embarrassed to be honest, to be straightforward, to actually mean what they say, that this is treated almost as a weakness. But it isn't a weakness. It's just occasionally not en vogue. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be practiced.
Absolutely. I mean, there are two things that you mentioned that really, it's like an inner calling. One is the value, and the other one is awareness. And I feel like both, especially value of human life these days, in this current political environment, is just so diminished, and it's almost to the point of equaling a human being to nothingness, especially if you consider how some of the global leaders are making decisions that are affecting people in their countries or in neighboring countries. And it's the same with awareness, how much we know, how much we are eager to know or learn about, and keep on sort of educating not just ourselves, but our surroundings and our community. And this is one thing I'm definitely seeing among my friends who have daughters, especially, who are constantly on the lookout for really interesting books on women's rights, on women's emancipation. And I feel like there's definitely a much bigger sort of wave of that kind of movement in raising a generation that is more aware and where value for human life is certainly treated and viewed differently than we're seeing today.
I think you're very, very right. I mean, that's in a way a strategy that was used originally for the so-called enemy, either the enemy in war or the enemy in whatever circumstances you would define the other side as the enemy, were part of the way you mobilized people against that enemy, real or imagined enemy, was to dehumanize that enemy. And that strategy somehow has turned around and bit everybody who's invented it right back. Because in the end, what happened was that the power that be, the governments that call themselves democratic but very often are actually authoritarian, although they were elected through a democratic procedure, dehumanize their own citizens in order to abandon their responsibility to them or their responsibility to their office to which they were elected. And this is why I think the Havel theme and the Forum 2000 theme of responsibility, accountability, solidarity, in some ways, facing the task of being accountable to the people who elected you, mm-hmm. and serving them, however corny that might sound at the moment. But it is a very important aspect, or I would say key aspect, right. of checking the worthwhileness of a government. Mm-hmm. Not only the quality of the government, but if you have a government that's actually cheating you all the time, that's not performing its task, that doesn't understand what its task is, it's basically useless or worse. Mm-hmm. Or worse. I mean, it's directly damaging to the society, and this is something that we are faced with at the moment, especially since a number of authoritarian leaders around the world, East and West. We used to think of authoritarian leaders in our part of Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, but actually now they're quite evenly spread around the world. In a way, they have mastered some aspects of democracy, especially elections. They figured it out in a way. And in the process, they have also managed to convince majority, I think, for at least for now, majority of the people that elections equal democracy. Mm. Multi-party elections are democracy, which is, a big hoax, a really major hoax, because multi-party elections is only one initial aspect. Almost a sort of pre-democratic act that then potentially enables democracy to develop and to flourish in due process, in guaranteed rights, in rule of law, in democratic way of achieving or deciding on certain legislation, in rights for the minorities and of the minorities, which is, I would say, a key aspect of democracy. All this, not to speak about freedom of the press, real freedom of the press, really free markets, not markets gazumped by the cronies of the politicians, etc., etc. That has completely disappeared from discussions of democracy. It is, is there more than one party? Yes. Mm-hmm. Were elections relatively free, which has started to mean, were they actually stuffing the ballot boxes? Not have they monopolized the media, have they monopolized the public space, but have they actually come from home and put additional ballots in the ballot boxes, or even, as we know from some experience, brought ballot boxes already full of ballots from home. If that didn't happen, that means the elections were free. That means we have a democracy. Never mind that whoever was elected through this process have previously completely controlled the media, have the control over the economy, has his nephews and friends and
involved in corruption
buddies run all the companies, etc., etc. So, in a way, I think we need to face or sort of rethink the concept of democracy and wrestle it away from this smart, mostly right-wing populists, but it's almost irrelevant whether they're nominally right-wing or left-wing, because the technology is completely identical. Wrestle it from these populists and autocrats in order to create or recreate the awareness that it's not this one act, it's quality of life, and it's, as Havel would say, it's accountability.
Absolutely. You basically led me to my next question, which is about the discussion that you will be moderating at the upcoming Forum 2000. And it has this, very strong title, and I'm going to read it. It goes, "Politics of Fear, Politics of Hate, Facing the Growing Intolerance in Democratic Societies." And that's just so much to, dissect and look into individually. But I think in follow up what you just said, when you say that, we need to rethink the concept of democracy, and also, when these autocratic regimes or governments hold elections, it doesn't necessarily equal democracy and whatnot. And of course, this other side, the group of people who keep believing, who keep thinking that if there is an election, then yes, it is a democracy. Or if this person says this way, then it is absolute truth. So my first question is, how, when we rethink democracy, how do we bring together all these different groups and actually talk sense into them? Because it's, on one hand, we have these leaders. On the other hand, we have the groups within the countries and also outside who support this type of mindset. And then, obviously, you have the obvious group, the people who get impacted directly by the low quality of life, who are afraid to speak and who do not necessarily have the power or the means. So how do we rethink this? How do we bring in different ideas, different initiatives, maybe even completely different approaches within our countries, within our governments, within our community, in order to address these issues?
I know that understanding something doesn't mean changing it. Doesn't mean that automatically the moment you understand something, things will get better. They won't. I mean, you need to act, and you need to act smartly. But I think that understanding helps. Understanding is not changing these things, but you cannot change these things without first understanding it. So, in a way, the objective of this panel that I will moderate and take part in is to further the understanding of what is happening and look at as many things that at first look completely absurd. Like, for instance, why people vote for people who promote policies or who represent policies that will actually harm them. Why people vote against their own interest. And I think this is closely related to what we talked about. And this is how these autocrats and populists have figured out this election aspect of it, of democracy. And for that, you need to mobilize people. And the best way of mobilizing people is to heighten emotions, collective emotions. This collective emotions can be something positive, like, love, although collective love is always very, very problematic in my mind. But the best are rage and outrage. Fear, hate, rage, outrage. And for that, cluelessness is also an important aspect. The less you know, the less educated people are, the less informed they are, the more likely they will be to be afraid of something. And that can be turned very effectively into a means of mass mobilization. Mass mobilization you need because you need those votes. These people have more or less agreed that they will rule as autocrats, but they will get the legitimacy, formal legitimacy for that through voting. And in the early 90s, we here in the Southeast Europe or in the Balkans thought that we were somehow the tail end of this emotional mobilizations through chauvinism and nationalism and all of this, and that we were somehow the last of the sort of ancient or 19th and early 20th century Europe, and that this has disappeared. It seems now that in a way we were the avant-garde, that this was the rest of the world only caught up recently with this notion that you go for a collective emotion, preferably with an imagined, real or imagined enemy that you then blow up beyond all proportions, make people afraid of it, and then make them outraged. I'll give you it is a dramatic example, although it didn't, for now, end up in any kind of tragedy, but in a, I think, very sad, it ended or contributed to a sad event. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was, some years ago, the Daily Telegraph's correspondent from Brussels. And since reporting from Brussels was relatively boring, and he is definitely not a boring guy, he started inventing things that would create outrage. Like, for instance, these awful Europeans will make us measure the cucumbers or the shape of the potato, or things that were not true, but were interesting. And in a way, created outrage, and people could then talk to each other about it, and they actually did read it. However, it not only contributed to the circulation of the Daily Telegraph, but it actually contributed to, in the final instance, to Brexit. And so it had consequences that I think were very sad for Britain and very sad for the European Union, not to use a stronger word. This technique of creating outrage is something that I think we need to understand, and we need to understand how powerful that is before we think of a strategy to confront it and to deal with it. I always thought that quality and mass public education was an important instrument. I still think so, but it's not enough, and it's not fast enough, so to speak. I mean, we need something that will work almost immediately, because we need to deal with this. This is also dangerous because behind this rage and outrage that's created, this is a smokescreen. I mean, let's say in the Daily Telegraph Boris Johnson case, it was in order to make it more interesting and sell more papers. But in some more, let's say, bigger and ominous cases, it actually hides the fact that, corruption is rampant, economy is being controlled by the cronies of the leading politicians, presidents, prime ministers, whoever in the country, that the difference between the poor and the rich is increasing in the last 30 years exponentially, which is not only a question of justice, it's also a question of stability of a society. The society can tolerate only that much inequality. After that, it stops functioning. And there are many signs of that around the world at the moment. And the corona crisis has only emphasized it.
Escalated, yeah.
So just to answer your question in the end, I mean, I don't think we will find ways to fight this in this panel, but I hope we will put as many different aspects of the problem on the table in order to be able to then look at the cure, possible cure.
And probably also looking at, cases like Poland, Hungary, but also Belarus now, where we're seeing some hope, especially as protests continue. And there are so many different groups now involved in protests. It's not just the women, it's the students, it's the teachers, it's the doctors. And I feel like all of these different examples where things are kind of going right, but where things went completely wrong, like we're seeing in Poland, for instance, or in Hungary, and elsewhere, how perhaps different elements of each of these examples can help us understand where we're headed, how we're going to understand this current phenomenon, and how in times of, as you rightly mentioned, global crises, pandemics like COVID-19, how are we even able to respond and cope in a system that is, as you defined, or in systems where all of these issues are very much present and keep changes from happening, positive changes from happening. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'll if I don't have anything that I'm moderating in that time slot, I will definitely enter the virtual room.
Please do. I mean, it should be fun and should be interesting, because you need to read books and be informed and blah blah blah, all of these things. But actually, in a way, it's a panel about our lives. It's right. Not, you need background, but it's not academic in that sense. Like, it's also very, very much real life thing, because it's even what you mentioned, Poland, Hungary, Belarus. From a distance, they look the same. The closer you come, there are three extremely different cases. But faced in all three very different cases, you have societies that are perplexed by their destiny.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And the question is whether they can get hold of their destiny again.
And I think that's a great way to wrap up our talk. And I really thank you for your time. I wish I could keep on talking to you, but I think we're quite limited, and I already went over time. So I really hope that Forum 2000 doesn't mind. But it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your thoughts. It's been really fascinating, and I really hope that next year we actually meet in person and get to speak in person, as with all the other Forum 2000 participants and speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.